Hey, this is Mr. Mitchell with another video about these little bitty things like viruses and bacteria and fungus. Here we have the protist. Go ahead and write down the questions for the protist, and I'll tell you about them. Protists. You may remember we've mentioned the word protist before in one of my videos. We mentioned the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and the protist kingdom. The protists are the odds and ends kingdom. It's kind of like these organisms didn't seem to fit in plant or animal, so we ended up in having our own kingdom in the protist. Now, you can imagine that the odds and end kingdom, the protist, would have a variety of characteristics. But one good thing about the protists as far as remembering them is they are unicellular, just one cell. So we're not talking about some strange animal-like creature that's walking around. We're not talking about some unusual looking thing that looks like a plant. We're talking about single-celled organisms. So maybe that can help things be a little bit easier for us. Well, one thing about these protists is they are eukaryotes. I hope you remember what eukaryote means. It means they do have a nucleus, and you can see there's a nucleus that happens to be right there. Other things we can learn about protists are that they live in moist surroundings, but you know, we can have some that are not unicellular, but they would just have a few cells normally. They're still small stuff. Some happen to be autotrophs, some happen to be heterotrophs. So what scientists have done is they have classified them in different classifications, I guess you might say. So let's talk about those different ones. One of those different type of classifications is animal-like protists. Now, think about characteristics of an animal. Animals are heterotrophs. They do not make their own food. So, as a result, these are the protists, for most part, that do not make their own food. They're heterotrophs. Now, most of these heterotrophs, these animal-like protists, move around from place to place to get their food because they cannot sit there and have photosynthesis like a plant. They are very small, unicellular, and they are called protozoans. So when you hear the term protozoan, that means it's a protist that is animal-like. These protozoans, some of them move around with what's called a pseudopod. Some of them move around with cilia, some of them move around with flagella, and there's another classification after that. But let's talk about these three that move around three different ways. That's a classification of them. A pseudopod, literally, pseudopod means false feet. If you were to take a look at this amoeba right here, it has these projections that are sticking out. These are pseudopods. They are false feet. Now what they'll do, here's some food, and they will kind of move the amoeba around, and these pseudopods, or false feet, will surround the food and close, and that's the way the amoeba engulfs its food, with its pseudopods. So some of these protozoans have pseudopods, these false feet, how they move around. Now notice these do not have any tails. They do not have any hair-like structure, because that's what these other two things are. The hair-like structure is cilia. Some of these protozoans have cilia, and you can see what the cilia looks like. It's these little hairs that are all around this single cell structure. Now, they're just a way for them to move around. You can imagine if these get to going all in one direction, it propels the protozoan in the opposite direction. So they are classified as having cilia, and they move kind of like in a wave. You may have heard of a paramecium. Paramecium moves with cilia. Now these are a little more complex than these pseudopods up here. Sometimes they will have more than one nucleus. They sometimes have a contractile vacuole. A contractile vacuole, you can see, is kind of this, looks like it has open space in it, this little circular thing with open space. What this does, it pumps water out of the cell. It's what a contractile vacuole does. It pumps water out of a cell. Let's talk about protozoans with flagella. We've mentioned flagella before. Here's a flagella, or flagellum is a long tail-like structure on the organism. And what that does, it helps move it around. You can imagine like a rudder. You can have the tail in different ways. You can flap the tail around to make it move. It's a long whip-like tail. These often live inside the bodies of other organisms. These things do here. They can have a mutual relationship with the host, but not always. And these kind of act like a parasite more than others. The amoeba and the ones with cilia, like paramecium, aren't necessarily like a parasite, but the ones with the flagellum often are like a parasite, and they sometimes can cause disease. But that's kind of a similar category to the ones that do act like parasites. The flagellum ones act like parasites, but there are some without flagellum that do the same thing. These that act like parasites feed off their host, and they can move in various different ways. Malaria is a disease that is spread by protozoans that act like parasites. You probably guessed what the next category is. These are protists that act like plants. Now, we mentioned the ones that act like animals are heterotrophs. What do you think about the ones that act like plants? You're right, they're autotrophs. So these protists-like these plant-like protists make their own food. That's how they are like plants. They make their own food, and they're called a certain thing. They're called algae. You probably have heard of algae. You've probably seen algae on some nearby pond. An algae is a plant-like protist. It makes its own food. They do end up making a significant amount of oxygen, because they do kind of function like a plant as far as the photosynthesis process. It comes in many different colors: red, yellow, green, brown, diatoms, dinoflagellates, euglenoids. You may not have heard of some of those, but those happen to be some of the plant-like protists, some of the algae. Finally, fungus-like protists. Now, you may remember me mentioned fungus in a recent video. So these are ones that kind of function like fungus. Now, you may remember a fungus is a heterotroph. A fungus cannot make its own food, so it has to spread out like that. Now, notice these look a little bit different than the unicellular ones that we mentioned earlier. So that's probably why these are not lumped in with those that are the protozoans. The protozoans, the ones that act like an animal, they're unicellular. But these, this one you can even see there laying on the ground, so it's not going to be unicellular. So that's why they had it like that. Here are some examples of fungus-like protists. We have some slime moles. These are bright colored and live in shady places, kind of like this. They ooze along surfaces of decaying materials, feeding on bacteria and other microorganisms. We have water molds and downy molds. They call it mildews here. Ooh, look at this poor fish. This poor dead fish. Decomposed by these water moles and downy moles. And you can see that this is a bigger thing than those unicellular protozoans that we talked about earlier. The Great Potato Famine was caused by a water mold. They're kind of like fungus. All these they're kind of like fungus because they attack food crops and even attach to dead animals like these right here. Don't forget to go back and do your questions, and I hope you learned a little bit about protists.